Okay, all right, good. So in the first book, the main character ends up in the Middle East, kidnapped, and ends up siding with his kidnappers and fleeing from a mutual enemy, where they end up captured, and his captors are all killed, and killed horribly, absolutely horribly, very much in Varangian style. So if you've been watching Vikings, the Blood Eagle was employed, and then a burning of someone very, very important to the main character, Jean. So this is after he's, they've supposedly rescued him, but actually he had gotten to the point where he didn't want rescuing.
He's changed allegiance.
And he's now under house arrest. So that's the beginning of the second book, is that probably the chapter that you may have watched, which is the death of his beloved. So here we go.
Right.
The old man spoke quietly, chanting some long-forgotten apothecary's healing rhymes. His expression was apologetic, and his hands moved with accustomed ease, yet his patient could not stifle the cries of pain the man's ministrations prompted. The salt water bit into his burns like fire, and if he had not been so weak, he would have fought the old man off. The pain was intense, causing Jean to bite into his pillow and sending his body rigid. Yet it was nothing compared to what would follow. Jean shut his eyes tight as he saw the healer pull out the metal-bristled scourer and immerse it in the saline solution. He tried to prepare himself for the tearing of his flesh, the opening of his scars, but he knew he could not block out even 1/10 of its intensity. "Puta madre!" Jean screamed in Catalan, cursing the Holy Mother in a tongue he hoped his captors would not understand. The old man had promised this would help him heal, allow him use of his arms and legs again, and this was the only reason he endured the torment. Jean tried to breathe deeply, swearing to himself he would not beg the old man to stop. It was not the healer's fault the treatment was so cruel. He reinforced his will, imagining Ishtar was watching him. It gave him the strength he needed to fight off the pain, which would otherwise reduce him to a blubbering coward. Whenever Jean invoked her memory, he always remembered two things. First, the image of her in the grip of death amidst the flames, and secondly, the vision he had received as he plunged into unconsciousness from the smoke that filled his lungs. At first he had tried to rid himself of the image of her suffering, but as the days passed he came to realize he must never forget her death or the atrocities visited upon her. He must remember them and avenge them until his dying day. The scourer clawed at his skin, breaking down the scars that prevented him from standing, from using his hands or feet. "I deserve to suffer," he berated himself, stifling a cry. "I deserve to suffer because she suffered for me and what she believed." With every pass of the scourer, Jean's face grew less contorted as he channeled the agony inward, where it fueled the bonfire of his rage and self-loathing. Why didn't I fight for my family? Why didn't I fight God for Lara? The steel bristles caught in his flesh and would not release. The healer looked at Jean in terror, eyes darting from the brush embedded in Jean's thigh to the door through which he longed to flee. "It is all right, old man. I deserve this," Jean spat, as he grabbed hold of the brush handle and violently wrenched it from his flesh. Warm blood spurted in an arc, covering both men in a fine mist of red. Jean handed the brush to the reluctant healer and encouraged him to continue. So there you go. There's a couple of...
That was nice and tame. No.
Wow. That's wince-inducing. Like as I'm listening to it, it's like it makes me wriggle and wince.
Do you love that when you're writing it, or do you get immersed in it? Is it?
Yeah, no, I get immersed in it. It's like a movie that plays in my head. So I'm seeing it and I'm writing it. I'm trying to catch up with the video that's playing. And so even the battles, like when I see the battles as if I'm in them, and then I write them from the perspective of the character.
And how tiring is it to write scenes like that where your lead character is in pain and going through this terrible scenario, obviously with a good, the desire for a good outcome. But how does it feel to be writing a story of pain for your lead character?
It's really interesting because when it first comes to me, it's like I until I write it down, it's running around in my head and it stops me concentrating on other things. So it's like when you wake from a really bad dream that might have been traumatic and it just hangs on. Once I write it down, I feel much better. But at the end of The Infidel, with the death of a very major character who most people have said to me, is their favourite character of the first book. It was I bawled. I cried my eyes out. And but I couldn't avoid her death because all of the plot lines, that was where they were going to resolve, and the characters very often write themselves in a way. It's like once you've developed their character, it's almost like they're making the decisions about what happens to them rather than you. And sometimes you have to write stuff about them that you don't want to write, but they make you.
Oh wow! And you and I were talking a little earlier about that. This is book 2 of the first 3 of potentially 6 or 9.
About a dozen I've mapped out. Yeah.
So can you actually see the story arc for the whole of that dozen? Wow.
Yeah, I don't have all of the detail, but I have the major markers for. So this is the second book that's set in the Middle Ages. The third book goes back to the 1st century AD, so the early Christian era. There'll be 2 books because what happens in the second book refers back to things that happened in the 1st century AD or BCE. And sorry, not BCE, CE. And so there'll be 2 books set in that era, and then this series can continue on through the Renaissance. But then another series will spring up and go through France from the books that are set in the early Christian era.
With what's the word I'm looking for? Family strings. Familial strings, links, threads through into the new stories. So it'll be the grandchildren.
So it'll be the secrets that are found by this family in the second book that lead back to a story that is common to many families that starts off in the early Christian era and then branches out in different ways. So I have the Italian series. I have the French series, and then I have the series that's set in the 1st century, and that'll span Anatolia, Rome, the Levant, and Egypt. So it'll be.
How many of these places that you're writing that I know you've visited, obviously you've visited Italy, and but are you going to need to go and visit some of these places to get a real kind of?
Well, not really, because how they are now is nothing like what they were then. And in fact, I found that I'm better off working from the ruins of sorry, I'll just shut a door for a sec. So I'm actually better off working from historical records and first-person accounts. So what I've done with both The Infidel and Veritas is to get first-person accounts of the Crusades and accounts and descriptions of the buildings, because how those buildings look now is nothing like how they looked then, if they even exist now. So I found it's actually better for me not to see how it is now, to immerse myself in the historical record and the first-person accounts from Arabic and French and Italian and Jewish sources. And then that's what I'm doing with the third book, which goes back and follows a particular apostle in the 1st century AD. And I'm taking that from a lot of the, some of the books that have been more recently found, some of the Nag Hammadi documents from the Didache, which is one of the earliest Christian documents ever written that predates most of the Gospels. and from Tacitus and many of the other Roman and Greek historians of that era, as well as, of course, the New Testament documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi documents. So yeah, so the book I'm doing right now is kind of, it's like I'm squashing. I've been researching it probably. I found my first research notes for it dated from 2000. So I've been on that trail for about 14 years,
Wow.
whereas with Veritas and Infidel it was about 10 years of research and then kind of refamiliarising myself again over the last couple of years.
And
so yeah, it's a big commitment.
If you haven't done any writing for a while, do you find the characters kind of going, we're waiting? Like, do you get the kind of, coming up feeling from them?
Well, it's really funny because I do a lot of research until it's almost like, they talk about that hyperfrontality where your frontal lobe shut down and your subconscious mind is doing all the work and it just spits out the answers. And so I think when I do a lot of research that's very conscious, I'll then get to a point where the storyline and characters are writing themselves and they pop out. And so a funny thing happened is while I've been researching the third book, which is called Paul the Assassin, the sequel to Veritas, which will be in the Italian series called Faenza, started to pop out, and I wrote a whole chapter that's based on the characters back in Italy, some years distant, and I just had to get them out because there's a few new characters that were obviously kind of just adding the back of my mind, and they wanted their say. So this chapter popped out, and I'm going, hang on, you're not being written for another 2 years. What are you doing?
It's the teaser chapter for the next book.
Yeah, so I have my opening chapter for what will be book 5. So that one's
well, she said she's got the story arc in her head.
Wow.
So about 12.
The characters in some of them just kind of appear, do they, in your mind?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you create it, and when you look at the historical background, you're immersing yourself in a world. So where a fantasy writer has to create all the details of that world, I have to immerse myself in the history.
Like archaeologist.
Wow.
Yeah, and then you create a thread of a story that weaves known facts with, kind of blank areas. And I like finding mysteries. Like if I find that someone was killed mysteriously, I think about a way that I could weave them into my story. So if someone significant at the time died in a particular way, but centuries later we discover they were actually poisoned because archaeologists and paleo forensic scientists have now discovered this person's poisoned, then I like to add that in. So a lot of the stuff I put in is outside of the mainstream history books. It's things that are really been enabled because of the technology we have today that allows us to, assess the genetic character of people deceased, or can analyse the contents of their stomach,
Exactly.
Can forensically look at the blow to their skull and tell you how they died. And so I'm really assisted by that stuff because there's a scene in Infidel which is, and it's actually taken from a first-person account of the preparation of an abbess for burial. And so I was able to use that account for this, situation that one of my characters is involved with, where she's asked to be, to basically to be take the dictation of the anatomist running this kind of almost not quite a it's not really like an autopsy. But they remove her organs, and all of these sorts of things were done, which was done to holy people, and they preserved their organs separately. So I have this fantastic account of a medieval kind of autopsy style thing that my character gets to be involved in. So things like that are interesting, that give people insight. And so, what the chapter I've just read, how the Middle East was very far advanced to the West in their treatment of injury and wounds. And if you got injured or were sick in the Middle Ages, you would really hope you had either a Jewish or an Arabic healer around, because you had a chance of survival. If you were in the hands of a Christian monk, you were pretty much dead.
Yeah.
You were just lucky if you survived.
Effectively, of the kind of the breaking down of the malformed scar tissue is pretty advanced. I mean, they do that now, only they do it carefully and surgically, but that process of the way that they get rid of scars that are dysfunctional is they still remove the scar and then help the healing happen better second time. So the fact that they were doing that all those many years ago is just amazing.
It seems like history books should be, mainstream history books should be
written like this.
They should be electronic now. They should all be translated electronic so that when people do make new discoveries, they can just update them as they go. So it literally changes whenever you go into the history book.
I was going to say that I agree with that completely. Right. Like the old encyclopedia comes with the next volume. Now you buy the upgrade and it backfills history.
They're missing so much anyway. We've been watching programs now that talk about ancient aliens and things. I mean, stuff that's just been around for thousands of years that our history hasn't gone near it.
No.
Discovering it now.
And you know, there's remnants of Bronze Age brain surgery. They've found the tools and they've found skulls that showed that the person had brain surgery and then lived for quite a few years before dying. So it was successful to some degree. It didn't kill the patient.
At least they didn't die at the time.
Bang him on the head with a rock. I think.
Yeah. What I thought you were going to say, and I think is also valid, is if only all of our history books were kind of written with the love and the flair and the passion and the bringing to life that your writing has. Imagine how many more happy history students there would be on the planet. War and stuff. It doesn't have to be boring.
Well, history used to be written that way. I've got, up here on my bookshelves, I've got, I'll see if I can pull some down. So I've actually got these, fantastic books that take first-person accounts. Runciman wasn't first-person, but he's quoting Viger-Hardouin and Joinville, and what's really cool is this book here, which is The Chronicles of the Crusades. Which I'll to. And so I actually made one of these chroniclers a character in he'll be a character in Veritas and in book 5. So he because he was there and he was part of the French contingent that was part of the Fourth Crusade, and so he actually becomes he's a character in my book, which is really cool that because when you read the chroniclers of the Crusades, I mean, there are some tedious bits, which is important because they actually have transcripts of letters and agreements and treaty negotiations, which you do want them to be valid. But there is the passion of people who were involved. It was life and death for them, and they lost comrades and friends, and so I like to honour that in my writing. And while yes, I have fictional characters that fill in gaps of things that we know were done, but who did them sort of is lost in time. But a large number of the characters in my books are real people, and I've tried to portray them as fully and roundly and historically as I can. Because we have ideas like even about Francis of Assisi that he was this really meek, mild person, and yes, he was generally non-violent, and he followed a message of poverty. But, he would get really angry, and he had to fight for the life of his monastic order in the time that I'm writing. They were facing extinction, and it was in his lifetime, it was only 10 years or so after he had his visions. And then, the other orders wanted him to be excommunicated and his order disbanded, and he could have been burnt at the stake as a heretic for saying that Christ was poor and wanted monks to be poor, because you can imagine that wasn't too popular in the Vatican.
Some of them didn't want to play that game.
No, and so when you have people who have to fight passionately and speak passionately, you can't have he wasn't this meek, mild person that he's often portrayed, wandering amongst the animals. He had to fight very vigorously for that, and he rubbed a lot of people off. What was that?
Lachlan said he was the Bob Brown of his day.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. So there were as many people who adored him as hated him. You know, there would have been a lot of people who wouldn't have said very nice things about him, and then there were others who devoted their life to him. So, yeah. So and sometimes these characters are only there for a few pages in my book, but I've tried to give them.
And they're not all fiction characters. Some of them are real. And,
yeah.
If someone is interested in what happens, they can actually go and find out more about that person and expand their own learnings about it. So one last question from an authoring perspective. Do you have a routine, or does this come in floods and famines, or do you write X number of hours every day, or I know you have a busy life. How does writing this fiction work fit in?
So what happens is I do a lot of research, and then the writing starts to come out of its own volition. And if I try to write prematurely, then it's horrible. It's like extracting teeth, and what I write is pretty crap. So I know when I'm ready to write, because as we were talking about before, the characters kind of start to leap out at you and don't let you sleep. And then I can sit down, and sometimes I might write a chapter, and sometimes I might write 3. You know, I've had as much as 20,000 words come out in one sitting and not been able to get up until that was. So, yeah, and that's kind of uncomfortable because it's like you have to get it all down.
You can stop. No, you can't stop.
It's a bit like that. Well, and you don't want to lose it. You know, when you have that thread, it's like you have to see through till its conclusion.
So when you're doing that, when you're in that phase, so the story's just pouring out. The idea of the story is just tumbling out. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have to do things in distinct phases. So some of my writing friends are brilliant at writing a chapter and editing it, and, you know, being able to do multiple passes of the chapter. I'm not good at that. I need to write a large slab and be in a creative phase, and then when that's out of me, I can go back and be critical and analytical. But I can't switch from creative to analytical very readily. It's like the analytical will then shut my creativity down, and if the creativity hasn't finished coming out, then I've kind of stifled myself. Yeah. So that's my process. So look, it's kind of, you know, I do it in chunks. You know, it's that sort of discontinuous learning and productivity. So I'll do it in chunks, and it'll come out, and it might be an hour of writing or 3 hours of writing or a full day of writing, or it may go on for a week until it's done. And which then means I don't sleep a lot. Like I might only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night, and then I'm up and writing again. I talk a lot. I talk a lot about my characters.
I was also going to say, Lachlan said, how do you switch it off, how do you sleep? But what I was going to say is, do you get enough warning to be able to go shopping? And
you really just talk. Really just talking into a recorder.
I've often put ideas down through dictaphone or through notes, but I usually have to talk it to another person. So I have great writer friends that put up with me, and you know, I'll talk through some ideas. Or John, my partner, he gets his ears bashed a lot. Right at the moment, with working on the 3rd book, which is actually a prequel to this series called Paul the Assassin. John and my son, who's very into Jewish history, and he's into history of warfare, but particularly into Jewish history. They've been fantastic in helping me with research. So we end up having these great conversations where I'm thinking through, you know, the things that I want to include, and where very often I'll have hunches about a character, and then we actually go do the research and discover that my hunch is right. So sometimes I come up with these really bizarre sort of hunches about a character that might be historical. I have a gut feeling from having profiled them. And then when we really look into the deeper research, we discover actually, yes, that is something that isn't publicly kind of known and in the high school history books about them, but actually is something that's true about their character. And that's pretty cool. That's when I know they're living in my head.
And also having that kind of team, having those other people around who have some passion in the same area and who can, you know, contribute conversation, but also listen intelligently help. Like listen with a tuning factor that's higher than just, you know, a stranger going, so what's it about? These are people who, especially with your son having that sort of very specialised interest, it's like having an on-board editing committee going, I don't know that that's going to, what about this? And that kind of bouncing off, which is so critical when you're writing non-fiction. It's obviously working for you in fiction.
And I've got to say that the offshore oil and gas industry workers who often get to read my draft chapters as they're passed around the ships or rigs that John is working on are awesome. So they'll often send me things that they found that they think add to the storyline or validate something, or they'll say, "Oh, can we have more of this?" You know, so
as opposed to when you thought it was going to, yeah.
Can you then actually just do that? Provide them with more if they say we want more of this.
Yeah, look, if you know, it's really important to listen to the people who read your books and love your books. And so I actually went through a revising of Veritas because Veritas, which is the one coming out shortly, it had a lot of history in it. And what I needed to do, and the feedback I got from my first readers, was that I needed more of the emotional response of the characters to the unfolding and learning of that history. And also to make the action more active rather than passive. So, you know, that's a really great thing. And of course, then I went back and went, oh yeah, of course they're right, because you've got to keep people reading. You can't get them bogged down in, you know, in what might be dry facts.
And kind of theoretical conversations about it.
I don't know. I've heard plenty of speakers do that.
Well, actually, you know, one of the best things that you can do is read your writing out loud. It's amazing what looks fine in print, and when you say it out loud, you go, "Oh my goodness me!"
I know. See, when I was a journo on radio, we wrote for the ear as opposed to the eye. You had to write for the ear. You had to write so it came out, so that people could actually hear it and understand it rather than just the way you. It's different. Yeah, it is.
So I love the idea. So we heard just in the first chapter of the
first part of the first chapter. Yeah.
So I just love the idea of that as a teaser for people who might end up buying and reading the book. It's also potentially the start of you reading the whole book as an audio book. That's a whole different conversation. But as a start, because it's just because your reading style is lovely, easy to listen to. It's great. It's really good fun.
I find it fascinating that you're able to do what you do, where you just sort of write these books and you have this arc in your head as to where it's going to go, where it is now, where it's going to go. I don't think I've ever had a complete thought in my life.
Love that.
No, I mean, I can think of an idea, but I can fill it out and how it's going to end, and it just seems to sort of come up to one bit, and you go, okay, that's nice, but I've got nothing. I'm done after that. You know? I don't know how people do it. I really don't. George Lucas with Star Wars, same thing. He had it all planned out. So he's way ahead. Yeah.
Look, I think the thing is that, you know, I learned very early on in my acting career that while I loved acting, I wanted to be the creator, not the interpreter. And interpretation is creative, don't get me wrong, but I kept thinking of where the stories could have gone and should have gone, and I always wanted to know what happened to the characters after.
Yeah.
You know, the ending. And so I very quickly realised that, my dominant mode is the writing and the creating, and even when I was dancing, it was the choreography that really excited me. As much as I love dancing and interpreting, I wanted that creative control of directing where the action goes, and so I think it's just how different minds work, and then you have people who have the ability to interpret, and they add layers and richness and detail. And flesh it out even more, and that's a skill that you have, Lachlan, that that I don't have. So it's pretty cool that we've all got the things that we're good at, and we're not all the same.
It all comes together. So who's going to play the lead in the movie? Who's in your head as the lead in the movie of the lead character that's travelled through Infidel and into Veritas?
Yeah.
It's really interesting because some of the actors that I would have liked are much too old now. So when these characters first were created in my head, you know, that was when I was 20. So that's 20 plus years ago. So you know, so those actors are they're too old. They've been more likely to play the parent role. But there are some really good up and coming. They just need to be quite suave. You know, these are not Anglo-Saxon looking people.
Okay.
But there's some interesting, very nice, you know, dark-haired, dark-eyed, well, dark-haired, blue-eyed actors around at the moment. So yeah, I think
there are. There's a young guy that's in. He was in the movie Sisterhood of the Travelling Pants.
Oh yeah.
Whoever saw that, the guy that's the model for the art class. I kind of like him as Jean. I reckon he'd do a good job as Jean.
Yeah. And you could direct him.
Who is it? Who's the actor?
I'm trying to think. I'll have to look up his name, but he has startling blue eyes and dark hair and olive skin, very dark olive.
It's such a very good look. Yeah. That look works really well, both on male or female. The women with those dark hair and blue eyes.
Like that.
Yeah. It's quite a stunning.
You're a stunner.
I wanted to see a story or read a story about, you know, how artists, going way back, some of the masters had their own studios and other people would fill in the painting for them or do the work. A lot of their work was done by other people and they added their touches to it and their signature, which I thought was interesting. It'd been interesting to see a story written from the perspective of the other artists, the ones who worked in the studio, who were quite brilliant, but never known, never talked about. And I just think it's fascinating. It'd be lovely to see what their day-to-day life would be like. You know?
Yeah, I think that's a great one. Maybe you should start taking some notes.
Would they be really ticked a lot in life? I mean, no, I'm not. It's just curious. I think it's curious. I don't have it in my head. I'm just saying that idea is in my head. Anything else?
Someone who watches this video might go, "What a great idea for a book! I'm going to write that."
Good on, just send me the first copy. That's all. It's good. Isn't it?
Well, hopefully, and you've got some things out of it that you can edit into something that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sounds really good. No, but thanks guys for being on and surviving the Google juggernaut and getting on with me and asking great questions and being just fantastic mates.
Well, we love you, Liz, and
you're very clever.
We are very clever, and we're looking forward to continuing on this journey. And you know, we're about to buy books 1 and 2 of 12, so that's I love series.
It's sort of a commitment, really. And Helen, we should have a conversation off air about what your plans for your book. Love to help.
That's fantastic. We will definitely do that. Give me a little bit more time to flesh it out, and then I'll get some guidance from you on what to do next with some of the people that you know. That would be fabulous.
That would be my pleasure. All right, lovely people. We'll talk again. Thanks for being part of the broadcast. Bye.
Bye.